And of course, also I know about Felix. Felix Gatineau, right? Felix Gatineau, right? Of course we know about him. And one of the books that he wrote was very important for my research. So there's another connection with Southbridge. And so what I'm trying to do with this book and with these talks I'm doing around New England is to connect this Franco-American story with the broader United States history. Sometimes this story is told in a very parochial way. It's a regional history. I'm connecting this with the currents of United States history. And in particular, there's three themes in United States history where I think Franco-Americans very much fit in. One of them being the industrialization of the United States. You shouldn't be able to talk about the industrialization of the United States without talking about the French-Canadian influence. Another theme, obviously, is immigration, particularly this idea of cross-border immigration. People crossing a land border into the United States. Right? This obviously is something we're talking about quite a bit in contemporary discourse. So, maybe we might want to look back and see another instance of people that crossed a land border into the United States. Another theme where the Franco-Americans really connect with United States history is the history of religious conflict in the United States. And I'm going to talk a bit about that tonight. And generally speaking, that's been a bit papered over. We don't really remember a lot about religious conflict that happened in the 19th and early 20th century. And so if we go all the way back, and usually I don't go all the way back, but tonight I'm going to go all the way back. You go all the way back. And before the Pilgrims came here to Massachusetts, of course, the French were starting to settle what they call Acadia, right, which is in the present-day maritime provinces. And before the Pilgrims, in 1608, Champlain founds Quebec City. So there already starts to be, of course, this settlement here. And by the late 1620s, no later than that, the English are attacking Quebec. Right? Look up the Kirk brothers if you want to know about that. So, the turkey hasn't gone cold on the first Thanksgiving. The English are attacking Quebec. And then there follows a century and a half of conflict between these two empires that are trying to control the land and the resources and wealth of North America. Nobody invited them, but they invited themselves, but that's what they were trying to do. And so it's a conflict between these two European empires, and you have Protestant New England and Catholic New France. And these become colonial outposts of these empires. And European religious wars reach their tentacles across the Atlantic Ocean, and they involve these colonists in them. So what I'm going to show here over the next 10 minutes or so is that the history of the United States and Canada are very much intertwined. Parts of the United States used to be parts of Canada. There's been big transfers of population between what became the United States and what became Canada. And it's not usually taught this way. It's you're taught the history of the United States, the history of Canada, and the connections between these things aren't generally acknowledged. It's not taught that way, but that's the way I'm going to talk about it tonight. Okay? And so here it's the height of New France, right, in the 18th century, right, and you've got primarily three large territories. You've got Acadie over here, right? You've got Canada, which included the Great Lakes region and the Ohio Valley, and Louisiana. And you've got Upper and Lower Louisiana. And there's communication between these different territories, and this is a colonial system that emerges in the 17th and 18th century. Okay. And so this is a map I really like, because this shows you population density, how many people are actually there, right? So you've got the English colonies here, the 13 colonies here on the East Coast, very densely populated. A big bunch of densely packed population there. The French primarily have their large population centers around Acadia, the St. Lawrence Valley, around what's now St. Louis, and down around here on the Gulf Coast. Right, and of course, if you look at these areas, you will see one French place named after another. The names weren't changed. People don't even realize, like Detroit. Right? That's the Straits. Yeah. that was founded by the French. And almost all the large cities of the Midwest were founded by the French or the Canadians. Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee, St. Paul, St. Louis, New Orleans, Natchez, Mobile, the list goes on and on, right? But the Americans don't realize. And so what they were trying to do here, of course, is to control the waterways, primarily. The waterways or the highways, right, through North America. And so then in the 1750s and into the early 1760s, you have the last French and Indian War. This is a translation of a title by a Quebecois historian. When his book was translated into English, he called it The Last French and Indian War, to say there were a lot of French and Indian wars. This is the last French and Indian War, right? And of course, one of the things that happened in this war is the Acadians are deported during the French and Indian War. The English deport the Acadians, who at that point were British subjects. They're declared prisoners of war. They are scattered up and down the 13 colonies, to England, to France, to the Caribbean, to all over Kingdom Come. So what is not often acknowledged about these wars is that they had a very strong religious basis to them. The rhetoric of this period very much invokes religious causes. For example, the French worried that if they didn't win the war, then North America would be taken over by, quote, the detestable errors of Luther and Calvin. Right? Jonathan Edwards, during this war down here in New England, he said that the French Catholics are, quote, the open enemy. So this is a religious war in the minds of these people at that time, right? And so the war ends with General James Wolfe's invasion of Canada. Troops, that's a big military force. That's massive. That's a big force. Now, back in the 18th century, it was massive, right? It's a massive invasion. They take over Canada. They take the capital city, Quebec, right? And so by 1763, there's a treaty that ends the war, and North America, as far as the Europeans are concerned, looks something like this, right? You've got the 13 colonies. The English now control what they've renamed the province of Quebec, and you've got these territories up here that were claimed by the Hudson's Bay Company. And then the treaty also made the French cede Louisiana to Spain. So Spain controls Louisiana for a while. Okay. And a very important thing that happens here is that these French-speaking settlers over here are cut off forever from France. Bye-bye, France. Right? And they are Canadians now, right? They're cut off politically, culturally. Their language grows up in a different way than it did over in France, right? They become Canadians. And so 9 years after this war, the British Parliament decides it's going to make a political settlement, and that it's going to make laws, a permanent law for the province of Quebec, and they passed the Quebec Act of 1774. It does a lot of things, but I'll just name two of them that really ticked off these British colonists over here in the 13 colonies. One of them was it restored the borders of the former Canada to include the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley region. Well, the colonists already had plans to expand west. The other thing that it did is that it, as a consequence of preserving the French civil law, it preserved the tithe that was paid to the Roman Catholic clergy in Quebec. And the New Englanders particularly were incensed that a Protestant king of Great Britain would not only tolerate Catholics, but establish the Catholic Church in a province under British rule. How could they do such a thing? And this was a major grievance in the American Revolution. And the Quebec Act is cited in the Declaration of Independence. So you don't believe me, I'll show you where that is, okay? And so, of course, everybody knows the big grievance was no taxation without representation. Well, why was there a Stamp Act passed in 1765? Because the British had just sent 20,000 regular troops to seize this huge domain, and they had to protect it. And they had troops stationed in North America. And they thought, well, these colonists will hit them up and they'll help pay for this. Of course, the colonists had a different idea, right? And so there's a revolution. And so exactly 20 years after 1763, you've got another Treaty of Paris, 1783, that ends the American Revolutionary War. And North America now looks something like this. You've got the United States. You've got British North America, which evolves into today's Canada, and it's kind of a motley collection of British colonies, Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, and what they're calling the province of Quebec, and Spain holds on to Louisiana for now. And what happens in the Revolution that's really important is that the Tories here, you know, from what became the United States, in New England they call them Tories, in Canada they call them Loyalists, right? They were the people who wanted to stay loyal to King George. So the Loyalists from the 13 colonies go to British North America, and they become the root of English-speaking Canada. And they, of course, are trying to form a non-United States, a counter-United States. And of course, at this point, most of so-called British North America, in terms of the European settlers who are there, speaks French at this point. This is still majority French-speaking up here. And so one of the things that happens in this revolution that's very important for the French-Canadian immigration here to New England is that an older merchant class in Boston is kind of muscled out by the revolution, and a new group of families takes over. And they have names like Perkins and Cabot and Appleton, and this group of families then takes over. And they do a very important thing, because in the generation after the revolution, they start to pivot from overseas trade to industry. And what they do is contributed very largely to creating the USA's first large manufacturing industry, which was textiles, especially cotton textiles. Okay, so there were experiments in cotton textile manufacturing all over the country, right? But during the War of 1812, Francis Cabot Lowell, he leads this group of Boston merchants who found the Boston Manufacturing Company of Waltham, Massachusetts, right? And this becomes the first integrated factory in the United States. It's really a watershed in the development of industry in the United States. And then Lowell dies young, and his partners and associates then found the mill town of Lowell, Massachusetts. And that becomes a watershed. That becomes a model for industrialism all over the United States, really. And this development of industry is spurred on by President Jefferson's self-imposed embargo on trade, which was passed in 1807. So the two great European powers, England and France, are harassing U.S. shipping during the Napoleonic Wars. So President Jefferson decides he will punish Great Britain by just closing up shop. There will be no trade. That really punished New England merchants more than it punished the British. But anyway, that's the idea. And then for much the same reasons, based on many of these same grievances, follows the War of 1812, and that cuts off the United States from its source of manufactured goods in Britain, very largely textiles that are being imported from Great Britain to the United States. And that creates an impetus for the development of domestic industries here in the United States. There's a bunch of things that converge that make that happen that I can't go into tonight. It's too complicated. Okay, but anyway, the industry, particularly the textile industry, it expands very rapidly during the War of 1812, and then by mid-century, cotton is king of the United States. Cotton is the biggest player in agriculture in the South, and cotton is the biggest player in manufacturing in the United States North. But what I'm particularly interested in is the labor history of these textile mills, right? This is the Amoskeag Mill in Manchester, right? Many hundreds, thousands of people who came down here and worked in these mills. And obviously this is where the French Canadians come back into the story, and you have another transfer of population from Canada to the United States. And so there was a report that was written in 1910, a United States Senate report, and it reflects back on the first century of textile manufacturing in the United States, and it divides the labor history of the mills into three periods as follows. Quote, "The first period was that of the Native Americans with a few English and Scotch, and in the second period a few Germans came in along with the Irish. But in general, the three periods were that of the Americans, extending to about 1840 or 1845, that of the Irish beginning in the 40s, and that of the French Canadians, which began immediately after the Civil War." Okay, so in this first sentence here where it says Native Americans, it does not mean indigenous people of North America. It means native people born in the United States who were generally white, spoke English, and were Protestants. Those were Americans. In the second sentence, you'll note, the first period was that of the Americans. Right? Then there's the Irish and the French Canadians. They're not yet Americans. Right? American meant a very particular thing at that time. And why did the Civil War stimulate this French-Canadian immigration, as that quote seems to imply? It's because the Union blockaded the Confederacy. It disrupted the supply of cotton coming out of the South. There was a cotton shortage, and that caused economic dislocation and labor unrest worldwide. There's a really good book called The Empire of Cotton by Sven Beckert. He's got a whole chapter where he shows that the American Civil War was an economic problem worldwide, not just here in the United States. Okay, and in one mill that I studied, the Cabot Mill of Brunswick, Maine, the price they were paying for cotton went from 12 cents a pound in 1860 to $1.87 a pound in 1864. So faced with a 1,500% increase, a lot of mills closed their doors, some cut hours. People went into other industries, like war production industries. Men joined up with the army. A lot of women at that point went west. There was a movement here in Massachusetts to get women at that time to head west. So anyway, the long story short, war is over, cotton's growing again, the mills open their doors, and their labor pool has evaporated. There's a severe labor shortage. So the mills had had a big PR campaign, sent agents to Canada to recruit these workers to come down here and work in these mills. And so that recruiting process actually began even before the Civil War. You see evidence of it in the 1850s, but there's no doubt that the Civil War was a catalytic event. And now you have entire families coming down here to towns like Southbridge, and you start having hundreds of French-Canadian families living in a town, and they start to form French-Canadian institutions like churches and schools and mutual benefit societies and newspapers, and this becomes a mass movement. And so in coming to the United States, to New England, and working in these textile mills in such great numbers, the French Canadians were the saviors of the cotton textile industry, and really had a role in saving the economy of the United States after the war, because cotton textiles were the U.S.'s largest industry, and New England was the center of that industry. And this is really some startling stats that I found. In 1900, nearly a quarter of all cotton mill workers nationwide are of French-Canadian origin. That's not in New England, I'm talking all nationwide, right? In New England, 44% of all cotton textile workers are French-Canadian descent. In the state of Maine, almost 7 out of 10. So an extraordinary relationship to an industry that they have here. And so the French-Canadian era of the textile mills, which started after the Civil War and really lasted until into the 1930s, when the industry starts to decline here in New England. In coming here, they saved the industry, they saved the investors and the owners, and their row of Victorian houses that you see in every single mill town that you go in. Right? Saved all of that, and I would say that so important was cotton agriculture and cotton manufacturing to the 19th century economy. It doesn't go too far to say this French-Canadian influx helped restore the nation's economy after this disastrous Civil War. And I think that this is a major and unrecognized contribution of French-Canadian people to the history of the United States of America. Okay? And so the result of this mass movement, as many of you know, between 1840 and 1930, you've got about 1 million French-Canadians and French-speaking Acadians coming here to the United States. The largest group here to New England, not exclusively to New England, but the largest group to New England. By 1900 rather, 10% of New England speaks French. That's astounding. 1 out of every 10 New Englanders in 1900 spoke French. And of course, they didn't all work in textiles, right? They worked here in New England in shoe factories and pulp and paper mills, and in brickyards and shipyards and in forests and on farms and other places as well. So in the earlier years, before the Civil War, say 1840 to 1860, when these immigrants begin to come to New England, there's very significant anti-immigrant and particularly anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States. It's mainly aimed at Irish and German immigrants, but of course this is the height of the so-called know-nothings, is this period, circa 1840 to 1860. And then during the height of the French-Canadian immigration, which is the 1880s and 1890s, you have a revival of this sort of anti-Catholic nativism. For example, in the earlier period, there was the Philadelphia Nativist riots. This is two periods in 1844 where there were several nights of rioting against Catholic neighborhoods. At least two Catholic churches were burned to the ground, houses were destroyed, they brought out cannon and shot a church with cannons, and all kinds of mayhem went down. And one source I read said 14 killed, 50 injured in these riots. Religious conflict in the United States. Closer to home here in New England, of course, there's the burning of the Old South Church where the Catholics were meeting in Bath, Maine. And there were similar incidences all over Maine in 1854. And in fact, this incident did directly affect French Canadian and Acadian parishioners. The Catholics in Bath first met in the home of a guy called Charles Doucette, who was an Acadian from Nova Scotia. If you look at the early records of that church, you see lots of French Canadian, Acadian. They had Fortier, Fontaine, St. Pierre, etc. at this time. And then, just for example, a year after that, you had the Election Day riots in Louisville, Kentucky, where the nativists tried to prevent Catholics from voting. They had tough guys installed at the polls who would beat you up. And this led to riots where a German neighborhood was attacked, the Irish neighborhood was attacked, death toll, 22 dead, scores injured in these riots. Okay? And then in the later 19th century, like I said, you have a revival of this sort of anti-Catholic nativism in the form of the American Protective Association, known as the APA. And this was in the 1880s and 1890s. A pamphlet written by the APA at this time said, quote, "The lowest class of immigrants are Roman Catholics. Among these are mostly found the train wreckers, robbers, plunderers, murderers, and assassins of the country." That's what they thought. There's another piece of context we need to understand these first generations of French Canadians living in New England in the 1840 to 1930 period, is that most of them believed that they would preserve their French Canadian identity in the United States. And leaders like Félix Gatineau were very much promoting this. And so they had this idea that you can be a good French Canadian, you can speak French, you can go to your French language Catholic church, you can keep your customs without being disloyal in any way to the United States. They believed that this, in this idea of a dual loyalty, they believed that that was possible. And this caused great suspicion among a lot of people in the United States. This aroused suspicion. Elements in the United States started to wonder whether it had really been a good idea to recruit these foreigners from north of the border to work in our factories. You know, maybe this was going to have a negative effect on United States culture and politics. Maybe they're train wreckers, plunderers, murderers, and assassins. Right? Some voices were whispering at that time that that's what was going on. So there was a controversy that broke out around a report that was published in 1881 by the Massachusetts Bureau of Labor Statistics, and this report brought to the surface this growing antipathy toward the French Canadian workers. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics here in Massachusetts, its remit was to study the condition of the working class here in the state. At this time, it was led by a man named Carroll Wright, who's the principal author of the annual reports that the Bureau filed. And these reports are really invaluable sources for the labor history of this state and of the 19th century. They began publishing those reports in 1869. So for the 1881 report, the Bureau was researching a law that would have restricted the hours in factories to a 10-hour day. And I think that was just for women and children, not for men. But I think they wanted to restrict the hours of labor to a 10-hour day. And when the Bureau was researching this, it reported that they found a groundswell of opposition to the Canadian French, as they called them. who had entered the state in large numbers in the 15 years or so before 1881. And this is what the Bureau had to say, quote, "With some exceptions, the Canadian French are the Chinese of the eastern states. They care nothing for our institutions, civil, political, or educational. They do not come to make a home among us, to dwell with us as citizens, and so become a part of us. But their purpose is merely to sojourn a few years as aliens, touching us only at a single point, that of work. And when they have gathered out of us what will satisfy their ends, to get them away to whence they came and bestow it there. They are a horde of industrial invaders, not a stream of stable settlers. Voting, with all that it implies, they care nothing about. Rarely does one of them become naturalized. They will not send their children to school if they can help it, but endeavor to crowd them into the mills at the earliest possible age. These people have one good trait. They are indefatigable workers and docile. All they ask is to be set to work, and they care little who rules them or how they are ruled. Incidentally, they must have some amusements, and so far as the males are concerned, drinking and smoking and lounging constitute the sum of these. Now, it is not strange that so sordid and low a people should awaken corresponding feelings in the managers, and that they should feel that the longer the hours for such people, the better, and that to work them to the uttermost is about the only good use they can be put to." Okay, so this accusation, that they're the Chinese of the eastern states, that had legs, that got repeated. Okay, so for example, a man named Frank K. Foster, who was an organized labor leader, he was one of the founders of the American Federation of Labor, also known as the AFL. He read this portion of Wright's report into the record at a United States Senate hearing on labor. Okay, so now this is on the national agenda. And Foster added his color commentary that was very disparaging of the French-Canadian workers. And we have to understand the broader context, again connecting it with United States history. Exactly 1 year after this report was published, the United States Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. This excluded all Chinese from immigrating to the United States for 10 years, and then it was renewed after 10 years, in fact. So there was a ban on Chinese immigration. So this idea had been in the air for several years. So the idea that Carroll Wright doesn't know when he says these workers are the Chinese of the eastern states, that is in the back of his mind somewhere, impossible. This is the context in which that statement was made, okay? And so what happened next is the New York Times picks up on Wright's reports. It repeats these Chinese of the eastern states language in the paper, and slowly the press began to spread a conspiracy theory about an alleged danger that was facing New England from these French-Canadian workers. And basically this conspiracy theory said that the Catholic Church had deliberately sent these workers into New England to seize political control of New England, and then Quebec would declare its independence, become an independent country, then independent Quebec would annex New England to a new country called New France. Okay. Now that's ludicrous, let's just be clear. There was no such, this is fake news. No such plot existed, right? But this was a national news story in its day, which was 1880 to 1900. Big time national news. New York Times covered it pillar to post. I'm not talking 1 or 2 articles here and there. I'm talking on the news page, the editorial page. It's hammering this story for the better part of 20 years. Harper's and The Nation wrote long articles, mainly refuting this conspiracy theory, because as now, there's voices on both sides of any issue, right? So some people are arguing against the conspiracy theory, right? Academic journals weighed in. There were books written in both French and English about this topic, right? So what we're going to do here is just click through, and we're going to read together a few excerpts from the New York Times that will show how this conspiracy theory developed. It didn't appear fully formed. It developed over time, and new and more ridiculous allegations are added over time. Okay, so this article is from May 1881, and this article is reporting on Wright's report. Okay, this is the New York Times. It's reporting on the Massachusetts Bureau of Labor Statistics. And this is what the Times had to say, quote, "The French Canadians are indeed a peculiar class of people, bearing little resemblance to the intelligent and thrifty laboring population of France,
and still less to that of any other nationality on this continent. They are the descendants of the early French settlers of Canada, and under a century and a quarter of British rule, have preserved a distinctive character which shows little sign of progress or improvement. They are, for the most part, ignorant and unenterprising, subservient to the most bigoted class of Catholic priests in the world, and constitute a peasantry belonging more to the 18th than the 19th century. In recent years, they have been seeking employment in the manufacturing towns of New England. They care nothing for our free institutions, have no desire for civil or religious liberty or the benefits of education. The feeling which they excite is not fear or jealousy, but a sort of contempt, unquote. Okay, so they're not spreading conspiracies quite yet here, but some features that eventually get incorporated into this conspiracy theory are evident here, like that they're ignorant and unenterprising, and that they're priest-ridden, and they're kind of an old-fashioned peasantry. You know, these are stereotypes. And these are just straight-up stereotypes. So now it's 4 years later, it's 1885, and the New York Times returns into the story. It has this to say, quote, "The French-Canadian race now numbers perhaps 2 million, half of whom live in Quebec. They hold frequent continental race reunions. By reason of its phenomenal fecundity, it is fast gaining ground, not only in Quebec, but in all the surrounding states and provinces. This people, in its romantic hours at least, idolizes its language and holds sacred every severing characteristic, and now distinctly aspires to form a new France, occupying the whole northeast corner of the continent." Okay, so here you get the idea that they're going to revive New France. That's the idea that the Times is spewing here. And in fact, the race, it says the French-Canadian race, that was common back then. French-Canadians were described as a race. Yeah, they use that word a little bit different. It's one of the reasons I use that quote. That's a quote, a distinct alien race. It's one of the reasons I use that, because the race was understood in a different way. Can't get into that tonight. Okay, now it's 4 years later. Okay, the Times is still hammering. Here's what it has to say. Quote, "There is no evidence that the habitant or his ecclesiastical leader has thrown overboard a tradition that in the last few years has evoked something more serious than a smile from the average Anglo-Saxon. The tradition is that within a period, not included within the present century, there will be a country in North America called New France. It is to be constituted of Quebec, Ontario as far west as Hamilton, such portions of the maritime provinces as may be deemed worth taking, the New England states, and a slice of New York. No effort is to be made to realize this tradition until the French race in America reach a certain number. So prolific is the French-Canadian, almost without exception." So here you get this idea that this is a tradition. You know, all the French Canadians are in on the plot because they have this tradition that's passed down that they're going to revive New France. And of course, this gives the borders of this purported new country in New France. Right? It's getting very specific by this point. Okay, so this is 3 years later. This is 1892, and the anti-French-Canadian rhetoric really reaches a crescendo here in the New York Times. Quote, "Quebec is transferred bodily to Manchester and Fall River and Lowell. Not only does the French curé follow the French peasantry, he also perpetuates the French ideas and aspirations and places all the obstacles possible in the way of the assimilation of these people to our American life and thought. These people are in New England as an organized body whose motto is, translating, our religion, our language, and our customs. This body is ruled by a principle directly opposite to that which has made New England what it is. It depresses to the lowest point possible the idea of personal responsibility and limits the freedom which it permits. It is next to impossible to penetrate this mass of protected and secluded humanity with modern ideas, or to induce them to interest themselves in democratic institutions and methods of government. The migration of these people is part of a priestly scheme, now fervently fostered in Canada, for the purpose of bringing New England under the control of the Roman Catholic faith. This is the avowed purpose of the secret society to which every adult French Canadian belongs. And the earnest efforts of these people are to turn the tables in New England by the aid of the silent forces which they control." Okay, so where it talks about a priestly scheme and where it says that all French Canadians belong to a secret society. Here the Times cites a journal, an academic journal article that was written by this guy called Smythe. If you read Smythe's article, it doesn't really have this tone of paranoia so much, really. But it does mention societies that the Times has construed as something nefarious, right? And these societies were like the Union Saint-Jean-Baptiste, right? You know, it gives insurance and scholarships, right? It's not very subversive. And the other societies that they mention are these church-related societies that a lot of French Canadian people did belong to, like Les Enfants de Marie, you know, that my great aunt belonged to, and the Sacred Heart League. They might do something really subversive, like have a charity bake sale. A pinochle tournament, something like that. These were not subversive. Okay, and so it was not only the press that was hammering this, the Protestant clergy in New England got involved. And in fact, in this period, there were well-funded, proactive efforts to convert all the French Canadians in New England and the French Canadians in Quebec to the Protestant denominations. One of the guys who devoted his life really to this mission was Reverend Calvin Elijah Amorin. And in 1885, he wrote this pamphlet called The Evangelization of the French Canadians of New England. And what this is about is raising funds to found what he called the French Protestant College, which would have a missionary course for, to train missionaries to then go and convert all the French Canadians. He was under the aegis of the Congregationalists of Massachusetts, Amorin. And in fact, he founded his French Protestant College in Lowell in 1885, and then he moved it out to Springfield 3 years later, and it still exists. It's called the American International College. Okay. You should read what they say on their website about Calvin Amorin. Okay. So maybe I ought to do a talk there. Okay, so in 1891, then Amorin writes a whole book. It's called Your Heritage or New England Threatened. And what this is just a long-form treatment of this conspiracy theory, as pretty much as it appeared in the New York Times. Of course, it goes on for a couple hundred pages of this stuff. Okay. And in fact, in this book, Amorin claims 10,000 of French Canadian converts in New England and 40,000 nationwide. And the Congregationalists weren't the only one. The Baptists also had these very well-funded, focused efforts to convert the French Canadians of New England. In 1893, this article outlined these efforts. It's called The French Canadian in Quebec and New England by Henry Lyman Morehouse. And in this article, it says that there's a dedicated French department, as they called it, at Newton Theological School that's just dedicated to training missionaries to convert all these French Canadians. And this article calls for a $30,000 donation to make this a permanent endowed chair at that school. The Baptists claim 1,000 converts, and they had success in setting up French-speaking Baptist churches in Waterville, Maine, and Worcester, Massachusetts. I know the Waterville French Baptist Church was still there in the 1950s, 1960s, so that lasted some time. This article also describes a really funny contraption they had called the Gospel Wagon, which was like a mobile revival meeting. Right, so it's this big horse-drawn wagon. It's got an organ in there, and there's a pulpit, and for the Bible and all this stuff. And they would ride the wagon into the mill towns in Lowell and Lynn, Massachusetts, and Somersworth, New Hampshire, into these French-speaking neighborhoods, preaching the Baptist, denomination in French to these mill workers. Right? Just picture that scene. It's truly bizarre. Okay, and so here's a quote from this article. I'll give you a sense of the rhetoric of this period. Quote, New England is a magnet, attracting the world to itself. Quebec is repellent and shunned by the world's best blood. The one, a mighty current that has nourished the noblest characters, that has been as the water of life to the civilized world. The other, a sluggish, slimy stream that has fructified nothing and given to mankind nothing noteworthy. The one, a civilization where Protestant principles are regnant. The other, a civilization where medieval Romanism is rampant. the one helper, the other a hindrance to gospel truth, against the abhorrent forces of this Romish civilization we are contending, especially in New England, unquote. Okay? So New England and New France, they're still locked in this religious war. It's not shooting at each other over the border anymore, but this is an ideological war. It's a war of words. And so these are the ghosts of European religious wars from way back in the 17th, 18th century, and they're still haunting New England at this time, right? All that went on much longer than anyone knows. So you can read all about this and more in my book, A Distinct Alien Race. And you can buy a book now from our independent local bookstore. Or you can get it from the publisher or good old Amazon.com. If you buy a book and you read it and you like it, tell somebody, because word of mouth is still the most powerful way that you get the word out about a book. So I'm just going to leave my contact info up there if you want to get a hold of me. And should I take questions? Can I?
Please.
Okay.
That would be great.
If anyone has any questions.
Just
Yes,
a
sir.
quick comment.
Yes.
I don't know how many individuals here have been to Woonsocket, but there's an excellent museum here that relates a lot to the industrial talk that you just gave and the good and bad elements of it all.
Yeah.
It's called the Museum of Work and Culture in Market Square.
Yeah, it's splendid. If you haven't been there, I second the motion. That is an amazing museum.
And the society that you referred to has greatly supported it. When we closed the regional office in Woonsocket,
Yeah.
we channeled a lot of the things that we had in the office, including invaluable vase about this high. I always petitioned to have that encased when we had it, and it now sits in the Museum of Work and Culture.
Yeah, I went there and I looked all over the museum and I spent a day touring around, and then I came out and I was looking at the literature they had, and this guy who was working there said, "Are you French Canadian?" And I said, "Yeah, I guess so. I guess I am." And he proceeded to tell me that he had been a bookkeeper at the mills in the days when the mills were still around, and he saw the decline. He described that to me in great detail. It was great. It was a real learning experience. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
It seems that the Ku Klux Klan was involved in fostering this fake news
Yes.
conspiracy.
Yes.
Could you say a word about that?
Yeah, I have a chapter in my book about the Ku Klux Klan and their anti-Franco-American activity, and that's an excellent question, because the Ku Klux Klan was like the next generation of the Know-Nothings, the APA, and the next generation is the Ku Klux Klan as it existed in the North and in New England in particular. The clans were really different around the country. It was kind of like an independent franchise, right? So you'd buy a franchise and then you could hate whoever you had around. Whoever you had around, you could hate. So in New England, a lot of this hate went at Catholic immigrants, right? And so, Mark Paul Richard, who wrote the amazing book called This Is Not a Catholic Nation, that I highly recommend, which is it's the best study of the Ku Klux Klan in New England. He does fold the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s into the APA and the Know-Nothings. These are basically just different generations of the same ideology. Anyone else? Yes.
And David, your explanation of the all the quotes from the New York Times, it really helps to understand how the Ku Klux Klan could come in to the New England area and for a while, establish quite a presence.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there was.
So thank you for that.
Yeah, the extent of anti-Catholicism in particular in the 19th and early 20th centuries, that's been kind of papered over. It's not something that people acknowledge. Like I showed just a couple of incidents of riots, from, I could have shown you 20 slides of riots and stuff that happened. The convent was burnt down in Charlestown, outside of Boston, and there were riots in New York City. It just goes on and on and on. And racial conflict that is taken over in our understanding as the most important conflict that's existed in American history. But if you went back to the 19th century, you would find religious conflict was incredibly forming of politics at that time. The know-nothings they had a political wing called the American Party. It swept the legislature of Massachusetts in 1854. There were like 2 seats in the legislature that were not the know-nothings. I mean, that was a mainstream movement. It had immense power at that time. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Back in 1938 or 9, I got into a fight with public school kids because on the way to school in Chickadee Falls, I used to walk by the public school, and they used to sing French frogs, pollywogs, sitting on a hot dog. And I took offense and took on all the kids coming out of the school. And one kid was about a foot taller than I was, but I didn't give up. But I went home and I didn't want to tell my mother about it, but she noticed a big bruise behind my ear. You know, anyway, I was part of the religious wars.
There you go. Yes. Anyone else? Questions, comments? Yes.
Did you find evidence, like, for instance, in my family, my great-grandfather, I think it was him or his parents, came to Southbridge but changed the spelling of their last name to not seem so Irish, I guess, or not to, the story's kind of vague because I found a book in Canada with the spelling F-E-R, and then they were here in Southbridge and they were F-A-R.
Yeah.
So just because I think they came here in the turn of the century, 1902 or 03 in that area.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering what could have caused, is this part of why they would have, because of this, culture, the Catholic conflict?
Yeah, there's 2 things I'd say about that. One is that spellings of names, proper names, were up for grabs until relatively recently. Vermette, that was sometimes spelled V-E-R-M-E-T, sometimes spelled V-E-R-M-E-T-T-E. There are different spellings of it. And that's true for a lot of names. But there were people who anglicized their names so that they wouldn't stand out, no question about it.
A lot of names were changed.
Yeah, their names, they changed their names or they were given middle names, but a lot of people did change their names to not stick out so much, or just because, they weren't pronounced correctly. If you get a name like Boutier, the Boothaler. What is that? What is that in English? Right? It's like, it makes a mess of it. So maybe they changed the spelling to
So it may have been the way it
make
was
it.
written down when they went to the town hall to register to vote or something.
Exactly.
That it got, okay.
Right. Or they didn't. A lot of people in those very first generations of French Canadians who came to the United States were illiterate, sadly. A lot of them were illiterate. So they couldn't spell their name for the census taker or the priest or whatever, so they just spelled it the way they found it, how they thought it should be.
Or as they were registering, whoever was registering them
Exactly.
wrote it as it sounded to them.
As it sounded to them, right.
Yeah.
Or they would alter it to turn it into an English
Yeah.
name. Right, they would alter it to turn it into something.
Nativists became Rivers.
Exactly right. So they would translate it, like Racine became Root,
Root,
kind of thing.
yeah.
I had Racine relatives.
Who down
His name was
became
Philip
Baker.
Racine, and he called himself Philip F. Root. Sometimes.
I don't know if you can answer this question or not, but I've often wondered
Yes.
why many other ethnic groups continue to speak their native language. But I myself am the first generation ever to not speak French, myself and my cousins. But it seems as though like the Polish that I work with and just other groups have maintained their language. I just always wondered why a lot of my generation of French don't know the language. And I don't know if you can answer that or not, but.
Yeah, the research says actually that Franco-Americans in New England preserved their language more than some other groups. There was some research that was done comparing Franco-Americans with Italian-Americans. And they found that the Franco-Americans preserved their French way more than the Italians had preserved their Italian. But there was pressure in the different states to conform, right? There were laws that were passed that you couldn't have French language schools in some states. In Maine in 1919, they passed a law that no French in public schools. So a lot of people did face either discrimination or just the practical fact that they didn't go to schools where there was French, and it became English starting at age 6, and that's the way that they went.
And on the same idea, if you went to school and they did not teach French, you picked up the English and you brought it home,
Yes.
and as you grew up, and if you were lucky to go to college or have a trade or what have you, you just spoke English. So many, many times it was lost from the home point.
Another thing that happened is this is what happened in my family, because I didn't grow up speaking French as a first language. I learned French after the fact. But I had 4 grandparents who spoke French. And what happened is they moved out of the enclave. And this is a thing that happened a lot, right? Because my family, my dad's family's from Brunswick, Maine. My mom's family was from Bedford, Maine. Those were 2 communities that had very significant French Canadian populations at that time, but they moved out of that. They moved to Boston. So that was very common. So starting particularly after the Second World War, the mills start to decline, people start moving out. They go to larger cities, or even to a complete different region. They go to Florida, they go to California, whatever. So I think that's another thing that happened to the language, just the erosion of those enclave roots.
And I think like even in my family, where my mother, her first language was French, but she married a man who didn't know French, so maybe that was part of it too,
Sure.
that you married other ethnic groups that didn't know the language, so.
Yeah, that did happen every time.
I just have to add to your comment. I went to school in the 1st grade and I didn't speak any English. I spoke complete French. But at that time, the education system that year, they said no English in this school, or no French. So I couldn't speak English in school. So my mother, realizing that I had a hard time to assimilate or do homework or whatever, hired a girl to help me with homework and to understand what was going on. And she stopped speaking English, and speaking French. And so did my father, so my brothers lost it because they were a little younger. So by the time they went to school, they didn't use the French at all. She had an argument with a nun because I didn't know my prayers in English. But I knew them in French, and she said to the nun, she's praying to God, she's not praying to you. It's like, hey,
But I've heard people say, you can't speak to God in English. How can you do that? You cannot speak to God in English. I heard that plenty of times. Going once? Yes, ma'am.
To speak to the loss of the native language, my dad would speak to his parents in French about us. And then he made the mistake of putting us in French-Canadian boarding school. And the nuns came directly from Canada that took care of you after school. But all our classes were bilingual. And we had to, in order to communicate what our needs were, physical whatever needs, we had to learn how to speak French. Initially the nuns had an older girl standing beside them to translate from the English. After a few months we went home, we said, Dad, you can't talk about us to your parents anymore because we know exactly what you're saying. And I treasure that ability to speak French, absolutely treasure it.
Okay.
Well, I'd like to thank David very much for coming all the way to Southbridge, and it's just wonderful for us to have the opportunity to hear you speak about your book. Copies of the book are available. We will have a copy as well in the library if anybody would like to borrow it, but if you'd like a signed copy, this is your opportunity. And possibly at Book Lovers Gourmet after the program, if you don't want to do it this evening but at later, or if you meet somebody, because oftentimes it's after the fact people call and say, oh, if I'd only known, etc. So Debbie will have copies available in Webster as well. So thank you all very much for coming. It's a really great time.